Hello. A week ago, we were all waking up, or in my case, going to bed, with the results of the general election 2024. We remember some key moments of the night, obviously, the big names that came and went, and we remember what happened the next day. But are there things that happened that we haven't quite clocked? Are there individual results or trends that were just under the surface of the Labour landslide? Well, that's what we're going to dig into in this episode of Newscast, looking back at the results of the general election in great detail.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio, and joining me for this stroll down memory lane. Can it be memory lane if it was only a week ago? Let's find out. We've got Scarlett Maguire, who works for JL Partners, the pollsters. Hello again, Scarlett.
Hi.
Freshly rested from a little holiday, I hear. Also in the studio is John Burn-Murdoch, who's a columnist and chief data reporter for the Financial Times. Hello, John.
Hello.
Also excellent marathon and half marathon runner.
Ooh. Thank you.
Beat everyone from the Newscast team in the Hackney Half Marathon. And also joining us down the line is Professor Rob Ford. Hi, Rob.
Hiya.
Now, I know you were involved in the exit poll, so well done for getting it spectacularly correct. And also, you wrote that book, The General Election of 2019. You were a co-author. Does that mean there's going to be a general election of 2024 coming up?
There absolutely is, as soon as we can get it out, really. But that could be a while because, as we're going to discuss, there's an awful lot of stuff to dissect from this election. So it could be a little while yet.
Perfect setup. Right. Scarlett, let's start with you. You've had a couple of days off. What's kind of the big picture that you've kind of the conclusion you've reached?
Yeah, so in the run up to the election, I kept hearing the same thing was, isn't this actually all a bit boring? We already all know the result. Labour have been massively ahead in the polls. It's going to be a massive Labour landslide. Conservatives are going to do terribly. I'm bored. Let's, move on. And actually, obviously, of course, on the surface of that is correct. Labour did win an absolutely huge landslide. The Conservatives imploded, and truly shocking result for them, shockingly bad. But actually, underneath the surface, you can basically pick any constituency in the country and you will find something interesting to say about it. And actually, a lot of attention, quite rightly, has been in some of those shock results of the night, like Jonathan Ashworth losing his seat. My jaw was on the floor when that happened. But actually, there's so much interesting things going on as well when you look at the holds that maybe then don't warrant the attention afterwards in the following days. So, that's my biggest takeaway. Yeah,
in my kind of quieter moments when I'm not doing Newscast, I go in our election software and look at random places on the map, and yet there's a story everywhere. John, what's your big picture?
Something I've been nerding out on is what's happened with various age gradients, age divides, like who young people and older people are voting for. Because I think this election, and it's not all that this was new this time, but it's really thrown into light, I think, some things that have been steadily evolving over the last few years. So the one I'm particularly interested in at the moment is, I think we all got it into our heads over the last several years, even decades, that with Labour, it's if you're young, you vote Labour. If you're older, you don't vote Labour, maybe vote Conservative. But starting in 2019 and really clear now is that now peak Labour is 30 years old. If you're 30, you're about as Labour as it can be, but younger than 30, less so. So it's not a straight line anymore. Like younger men now vote slightly differently, younger women vote slightly differently. And I think that's really interesting because if those attitudes hold, then it could mean we have a completely different party landscape for the Gen Z coming through now.
Okay, we'll pick up on some of those things in a minute. Rob, give me a big picture thought.
My big picture thought is that the electoral system has never mattered more than it mattered in this election, never mattered more in terms of the outcome, and never mattered more in terms of how it affected the behaviour of voters. So when you looked at the marginal seats, voters responded to that. Labour overperformed in the marginals where they were second to Tories. Lib Dems overperformed in the marginals where they were second to the Conservatives. When you looked at the safe seats, people responded to that as well. The Conservatives fell more in their safest seats, but Labour also fell more in their safest seats. And as a result, we'll go into the next election with a bigger and more diverse set of marginal seats than we've ever had in any modern election before. It'll be the most hotly contested and the most diversely contested election ever coming up. So, Scarlett started by pointing out, it seemed like a bit of a boring outcome. Everyone knew what was going to happen. That definitely isn't going to be the case next time. Even if the polls point to a big win for somebody, there's so much going on out there in terms terms of the electoral landscape that there's going to be an awful lot to watch.
And I suppose, Scarlett, another way of putting that is the contest. So when it's the next election, whenever that is, we will be looking at these individual contests and working out what they actually are. And we will have Labour versus Conservative, Conservative versus Lib Dem, Lib Dem versus Conservative, Conservative versus Reform, Labour versus Green, rather than just like this sort of titanic battle normally as it's pitched between Labour and Conservatives, the two parties that could conceivably form a government usually.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely it. And constituencies are also becoming like increasingly idiosyncratic, it seems. So you might look at sort of neighbouring, what you might call very broadly, it's not perfect, I'm obviously broad brush speaking, red wall constituencies, and see that one sort of Conservative MP massively resisted the swing that applied in the neighbouring, very, very similar constituency. And so you have sort of Labour MPs even coming in those sorts of places on with much, much smaller, to Rob's point, majorities than you might think. And yes, I think we're going to see a lot of those sort of 4 or 5 way scraps. I mean, 3 ways would be most of them. But for example, if you look at Isle of Wight East, which was something I was looking at earlier today, there are 5 parties with double digits in Isle of Wight East. So the Conservatives held on only with just over 30% of the vote. Then you've got Reform on 20%, Greens on just under 20%, Labour on just under 20%, and Lib Dems not miles behind on 10%. And you think that's going to be replicated. Now, I think that is a particularly interesting example. But you have examples like that or similar, where similar dynamics that play all over the country.
John, Scarlett used the famous phrase there, red wall. Can we put that phrase to bed now?
I think with stuff like the red wall, it's not that it's gone back to being Labour forever, and in the same way that it never went Tory forever in 2019. It's more that this is probably looking, the red wall seats are probably now looking like your classic swing seats. It was a historical anomaly that these areas where the types of people and the types of views in those seats should always really have been Tory, and they only went that way in 2019. But yeah, I think it's more that these will now swing with the rest of the country. In 5 years' time, if everyone's gone one way, those seats will move with it. But they'll maybe lose a bit of that sort of mythical significance over time.
And so, Rob, the old definition of a marginal seat, was it that the majority for the winner was less than 10% of the electorate?
Well, that wouldn't have been a very good definition in this election.
Well, yeah.
Things were. I mean, we need a broader definition, really, given how volatile the electorate has become. But if we use a definition like 10%, 20%, I mean, pick your definition. On any definition, there's a lot more of them. I also wanted to pick up on something you've just been saying about the red wall. So, we spent a lot of time in the last 8 years or so talking about the red wall, which is why I found it funny that the equivalent set of seats for the Conservatives, seats that they've held for generations, they fell by the dozen in this election. And that did not seem to attract anywhere near the same amount of attention. I mean, we heard a lot about the blue wall in terms of seats where the Lib Dems were second, but there were also plenty of seats where they were second to Labour, where they haven't elected anything but Conservative MPs since Gladstone was Prime Minister, or since the Labour Party wasn't even founded. So that's another front that has opened up electorally in terms of a bunch of places that are now behaving in a very different way to the way they've behaved for an awfully long time. Another set of seats that used to be safe and are now battlegrounds. But for some reason, they don't seem to be attracting the attention that the red wall seats did in the last couple of elections.
Can I tell you my theory? It's because so many of us whose job is to interpret this stuff, we're up all night watching the results coming in. And I'm looking at the Newscast colouring in hexagon map, which we've propped up against the wall, which we had in the radio theatre for our all-nighter. And it's very, very red. Because Labour won lots of seats, but it's sort of not blue enough because we gave up colouring in the results, I think probably around about 4:30. And so actually you can see Conservative holds on that map are underrepresented because we didn't colour in the blue bits. And I just wonder if so much of the narrative of what happened in the whole event of the election is just really kind of front-loaded by the first kind of 5 hours of election night. Just a theory. We'll need somebody wiser than me and smarter than me to kind of prove that theory. Scarlett, what do you think? What are the implications then of all of that for what happens in politics and the things that we should be looking at in the next 4 or 5 years? Because I just think for the last Parliament, we got hooked on this idea of, can the Conservatives hold on in former Labour areas, which we kind of nicknamed the Red Wall?
Yeah, so something that I and a company were particularly interested in, I think, in the run-up to this election, or rather not even interested in, but just something we kept hearing. So I think firstly you could see it in sort of underlying data when you ask people's opinions about the parties and the leaders, but more from focus groups, the sort of colour that you got of people being fed up with everyone. Now, obviously, they were much more fed up with the Conservative Party and really, really keen to get them out of government, remarkably so. But it was this real, sort of plague on both your houses. All these politicians are the same. I'm not interested in it. And we sort of thought, well, this must mean that there is an extraordinary volatility, to Rob's point, in the electorate. And I think this is what we've seen come to pass. And I think, again, a lot of attention has been given to those gains that these parties made, whether it was Reform or the Green Party or different independent candidates who are campaigning on the issue of Gaza. No, I say it's not just that, but sort of broadly speaking. But there are so many other constituencies where they've now got so much more of a stronger foothold. And I think that means that if you take, for example, somewhere like Huddersfield, I think the Greens are on, I'd have to double check this, but I think it's now about 26% of the vote. Now, that means they're in a much stronger position just on the sort of bare bones of it to get there than they were in, say, Waveney Valley this time. And that is replicated again in lots of constituencies over the country. And that's just the Green Party. We're not even talking about Reform or independence there. There's another constituency, Birmingham Hall Green and Moseley, got basically no attention, but that's because Labour held it. But two different independent candidates for Gaza got more than 10% of the vote. If there'd just been one and the vote consolidated by the hand, that, again, not a perfect metric, it likely would have gone their way too. All of that is to say is that I think the electorate is incredibly volatile. We can see this. John will know more about this than me, but in Western countries, we poll elsewhere as well. I think Western countries sort of around the world, this frustration with, in inverted commas, mainstream party politics. It's just that we have a different electoral system, which I think produces quite different results. But I think the Labour landslide does sort of, I've sort of talked about this before, but does obscure that sentiment that's in the public. And again, that's not to say that this is not an opportunity for Keir Starmer to actually turn that around. And we're seeing he's already sort of enjoying a honeymoon. We'll see how long that lasts. We'll see what Labour's record is like. We'll see whether they manage to turn some of this volatility, some of this Lent vote, some of that staying home into something that's more enthusiastic for them. But at the moment, I just think it makes everything much more volatile and puts every politician... There's going to be so many Labour MPs looking over their shoulder at Reform, at Greens, at independent candidates, and they've seen now that shock results can happen, that people can come from nowhere, and I think that makes the whole thing a lot more tense for those involved.
Yeah, John, let's talk about those. I'm now just scrolling through my spreadsheet. Yeah, Labour's 7 losses.
Yeah, look, these were generally in seats with large Muslim populations, generally in poorer parts of the UK as well. But I think that latter point is probably overstated. It was really the Muslim vote that had a very significant impact here. This was something that people had been talking about for months leading up to the election. There was obviously a lot of anger, both within the Muslim community and other parts of that younger progressive Britain about Labour's position on Gaza. There were all those calls for a ceasefire when Labour and Starmer weren't quite willing to go that far at the time. Obviously, they came around later. So I think a lot of anger over that. And to Scarlett touched on this, like, it's when people say it's not sort of just about Gaza, it kind of is and it isn't. Like, Gaza is the trigger that causes someone to question, hang on, why am I voting for this party? Yeah. Like, so much of politics, especially among younger people, is you vote kind of based on maybe who your parents voted for or who you think people like you vote for. But when something like this comes along that leads you to think, wait, I disagree with that, it can lead you to questioning all sorts of things. And this isn't just a UK thing either. There's signs of this happening in the US now with a small but growing proportion of African Americans starting to move away from the Democrats. So I think you can get this where a certain event like Gaza triggers a broader... So it causes someone to sort of take a step back and question what they're doing. Now, in these seats where there was a clear sort of Gaza candidate, or even two, as you were saying, that just meant that a lot of people felt they didn't have to vote Labour. I think the Labour supermajority narrative that the Tories were putting out as well, and not just what the Tories were saying, but that people's knowledge that Labour were definitely going to win nationally and were quite possibly going to win in their local area, meant that I think a lot of people who were a bit disgruntled with Labour felt, I'm going to vote for someone else this time.
And Rob, I was going to put it to you, I mean, because you've written lots of books about previous elections. Like, to me, it seems that the old things that made people vote a certain way, usually class, how your parents voted, your level of education, all of that has been added to by lots of other factors that define people's political choices.
Well, yeah, that's right. But also some of the other things that have structured elections for a long time, like ethnicity, seem to be mattering drastically less in this election. I mean, I'd also like to put a shout out for Leicester East, the only Conservative gain of the night, and also, not coincidentally, I suspect, the seat with the highest Hindu share of the electorate in the country. And indeed, the Conservatives' second safest seat after this election is Harrow East, Bob Blackman's seat, new 1922 committee chair. That is the third highest Hindu population in the country. So, and there's a clear trigger there as well, a quieter trigger perhaps than Gaza, which has obviously dominated the news headlines. But I think it's not implausible to imagine that the Hindu population of this country has noticed the fact that the Conservatives have provided the first ever Hindu prime minister and have responded quite positively to that. It's been drowned out by the huge wave against them, but it is itself a hugely significant event. So we have the two largest religious minority communities in the country behaving in very different ways to how they have in the past. And then if we look at something like class and income and wealth and so on, you have a huge cluster of the wealthiest seats on any of those metrics in the country that have generally not done anything but vote Conservative for 3, 4, 5 generations, and they're now all in Lib Dem hands. The so-called Gales seats. There's these seats out there.
Rob, just expand on that Gales theory, because that was in a column in this week's Economist by journalist Duncan Robinson, who lots of us probably know because he's a very popular chap. Just explain to us what the Gales theory is supposed to be.
This was not Duncan's theory. It was imparted to him by a Lib Dem activist, supposedly. But apparently, the Lib Dems were looking to campaign heavily in any seat that featured a Gales bakery. And Gales bakery, we have one in my seat. It's not a Lib Dem marginal. They're very posh, nice bakeries with very posh, nice, expensive bread and muffins and what have you. And that would seem to be, it's reminiscent of when they used to talk about the Greggs seats back in the Red Wall type period. It's a marker of a certain kind of consumer, like Waitrose would be, I guess, as well. And the idea was these were the seats where people have been losing faith. And in fact, if we look back over the past 10, 15 years, especially the last couple of elections since Brexit, it's certainly true that if you look at these kinds of places, Surrey, Berkshire, Hampshire, the Conservative vote's been drifting down for a while. These are places who basically want government to leave them alone and not cause any drama and not rock the boat, because life is pretty good for them. They go and get their Gales bakery buns and then they go off to Ascot or whatever and they're quite happy. But right now they're not happy. They're not happy at all.
Other bakery chains are available at different price points, I'm obliged to say, although you did mention Greggs. Going back to Leicester East, though, I just remember in the old days when I worked on the Daily Politics, I'd get to go to all these places and meet all the candidates and ask them funny questions and try and catch them out and find out something really intriguing about the local area, like some person from history or a local landmark you could start and end your piece with. And just looking at Leicester East, I just really wish I could have done my old job in Leicester East because, as Rob was saying, it was a Tory gain from Labour. You're just like, what? That flipped the script. And then you just look at the candidates. There was Keith Vaz, who used to be like a really senior Labour MP who left Labour under, quite a cloud. Then you've got Claudia Webb, a former Labour MP who was like a big ally of Jeremy Corbyn, left the party under a cloud. They polled pretty much the same as the Liberal Democrat candidate and just slightly more than the Reform candidate. And you just think, I would have loved to go and meet all those people and see what was going on. The other one I think I would love to go to is Liz Truss's old seat, which I now cannot remember the name of because it's got too many points of the compass in it.
Southwest
Norfolk, Southwest, I think.
Southwest Norfolk. Is it? See, we can't even remember that. Southwest Norfolk. Yeah, let me just scroll down on my laptop to Southwest Norfolk.
It was the largest Conservative to Labour swing in the country.
Yeah, 25.9%, because I finally got there on my spreadsheet. Yeah, so she was just facing this battle of so the Labour candidate who ended up winning, a Reform candidate who ran her pretty close in third place, and then this guy James Bagg, who was an independent but who had previously tried to get rid of her as the Tory candidate way back in the 2010s, and then you had the Lib Dems and the Greens still getting more than 1,000 votes each, and then you realised she was also battling against her own reputation. So no wonder we just didn't see much of Liz Truss during the election. It wasn't just that they wanted to lock her in a cupboard. It's that she was really, really fighting on multiple fronts. Right, John, we're going to pick up on your point about young people voting because we had this voice note from newscaster Paris.
Hi, Adam. Firstly, what is the appeal of Nigel Farage to younger voters, who are typically meant to skew more left and liberal? And secondly, what, if anything, could the Conservatives do to win back the support of the young? Keep up the good work.
Thank you, Paris. Yes, because all the polls show. I saw a really interesting one about 16 and 17-year-olds who are about to potentially get the vote. And actually, amongst 16 and 17-year-old men, reform is really, really popular, which sort of doesn't quite fit with the stereotype of who a reform voter is pictured to be.
Yeah, look, I mean, and Scarlett, I'm sure you'll have bits to say because that was, as you say, a jail partners poll. I think it's really difficult to get representative samples of any part of the population, particularly 16, 17-year-olds. So I think, the exact numbers here we probably shouldn't put too much weight into. But I think the general finding of younger men being a bit more sympathetic to what a party like Reform is saying, there's now a fair amount of evidence for it. I mean, we're not talking massive numbers here. So if you look at the data from the British election study, for example, which is this 30,000 person sample, gold standard, been done for years. If you look at the latest data in that and you look at the percentage of men voting for reform by age, if you start up in people in their 60s, 70s and get younger and younger and younger, generally that population goes down, 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 down until you get to about 25 and then it goes up. So the very youngest men, your 19, 20, 21, 22-year-olds, about 12, 13% of them seem to be supporting reform. Again, not a massive number, but it's a much higher number than among young women, for example. And it is, as I say, higher than the sort of millennial men. So there does seem to be something going on there. Now, it's hard to know exactly what it is. There's a temptation, especially when we're talking about 16, 17-year-olds, to think, they're just trolling around, they're just people who think it's the sort of rebellious
kind of electoral anarchists.
Exactly.
Like, who could we vote for that causes the most chaos?
Exactly. And there's two things I'd say to that. One is that's probably a little bit patronising. I think young people are able to hold political views for genuine reasons, not just because they're trolls. But also the flip side of that is I think quite a lot of people cast votes on election day because they're just screw it all, burn it all down. So that's actually a motivation that a lot of people genuinely use, not just 16, 17-year-olds. So I think, this is something we should be wary of, pretending that it's 50% of young men vote reform or something. But it does seem to be a real thing. And an interesting thing I found that I don't think had been picked up on before was that this was actually true for the Conservatives in 2019. So again, the youngest men were more likely to vote Tory in 2019 than men in, say, their 30s. So the Tories in 2019 weren't exactly the party that you would vote for just as a sort of rebellious troll. So I think it suggests that among a smallish subset of young men, there is a real thing here where people are, they're buying into what some of the more populist right-wing politicians are saying. No one's done massive research into what aspects of this, is it immigration? Is it the general sort of, I feel like my young men are going backwards in society. I need someone to stand up for us. Boris Johnson, Nigel Farage do that. Unclear, but I think we've got enough evidence now to say that to a small extent, this is a real thing.
Scarlett, sorry for not crediting your poll, but I'm glad you're here. Do you agree?
I do agree with John, and I think actually picking up on a sort of slightly broader point than that as well, I think it's too easy to be too broad brush when talking about voters and the parties that they vote for and what that tells us about them. Now, obviously, that's an incredibly useful thing to do, and there are some things that you can sort of observe, again, in that sort of more removed way that say, reform voters care more about immigration, that fine. You can say that. However, I think one thing that we especially noticed, again, doing lots of focus groups in the run-up to the campaign, is that all voters will surprise you. And so one thing we found over and over again with reform voters is, yes, they care about immigration, but actually they really wanted the NHS fixed. They really, really wanted the NHS fixed. And now slightly distorted by the fact that they think a lot of the time they will see immigration as a lens through which the public services aren't working very well. They'll think it's all part of the same thing, but it's just that
So the reason you can't get a GP appointment,
right? Exactly, is because immigration might be too
moved to
high.
This country, so we don't have enough. Yeah,
exactly. But the thing we found time and time again is that it's not just reform voters sort of banging on it about immigration. Again, the people are just more interesting and more idiosyncratic than that. And again, as John's sort of pointing out there about people voting in the ballot box, again, and sort of it's less easy just to paint reasons on, I think. in those sorts of yeah, exactly.
Rob, one of the things I hadn't really internalised is just how important for Labour's comeback Scotland was. And my theory about that is that, again, it's something we'd sort of taken for granted because we knew that Labour were going to do quite well in Scotland, and the comeback was, we could sort of feel it happening. So maybe we then discounted it from the final results.
Well, yeah, and I actually think it is one of the most sort of under-discussed aspects of the result. I think Scotland is complicated and different. Its elections have been different to the elections in England and Wales for a while now, which means it's often hard to get it into the conversation. I mean, obviously up there they talk about it all the time, but down here we tend to sort of focus on the story as framed by England and Wales. But, the S&P completely collapsed almost as much as it rose in 2015 in that huge swingometer-breaking wave after the independence referendum. And it was an absolutely enormous surge in Scottish Labour's vote. So that's point number one. That was that. And point number two, which is really important, is it was a bigger swing than was expected by virtually all the polling. So the polling in Scotland seems to have substantially understated the scale of the Labour advance up there. And it was worth 30 or 35 seats. And if Scotland continues to behave differently to the rest of Britain, that could be really important in the next election because it's yet another facet of a fragmented electorate. And actually, just sort of to tack on to the previous discussion about young people and reform, a further facet of that fragmented electorate is, yes, young men voting a little bit more for reform, but I just looked it up because I had it in my head. Young women, 23%, nearly a quarter, voting for the Greens, and a much, much higher share for the Greens amongst young women than practically any other demographic. So you've got a really big gender divide on both ends of the political spectrum there. You've got, younger men drifting a little bit towards the radical right, and you've got younger women drifting by an even larger degree towards the party to the sort of progressive left radical wing of the spectrum, so to speak.
Yeah, I definitely picked up anecdotally younger women being quite enamoured by the idea of the Greens. Not necessarily the individual policies or collectively the policies, but just that as a sort of, as a brand to tap into. And I suppose that's one of the other themes, which is Keir Starmer moving Labour to the centre is going to alienate people on the far left and maybe the quite left as well.
Newscast from the BBC.
And that's all for this episode of Newscast. We recorded a bit extra, which you can listen to in the podcast edition, which is available in your podcasting feeds. Thanks very much. We'll be back with another one very soon. Bye.
Newscast from the BBC.